10 years ago, 7-year-old Mason Bell disappeared while playing in his grandparents' backyard during an autumn family gathering. One moment he was laughing in a leaf pile, and the next gone without a trace. No footprints, no sounds, just leaves. The search went on for weeks, but nothing ever surfaced. His family never gave up hope until a decade later, when Mason's uncle, clearing the overgrown yard for an estate sale, dragged a rake through the same leaf pile and unearthed something wrapped in plastic. What he found buried beneath wasn't just evidence. It was a secret the family never imagined, and it led to a truth none of them were ready to face. The October air was crisp with the scent of fallen leaves and chimney smoke, the Bell family estate alive with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and rustling trees. Golden sunlight filtered through the branches of the tall oaks that lined the backyard, scattering dappled patterns across the grass where children chased one another, darting between picnic blankets and lawn chairs. It was the annual Bell family reunion, a tradition spanning generations, always held on the last Saturday before Halloween. This year, it had drawn more relatives than usual. Second cousins from out of state, a recently remarried aunt, and Uncle Roy, who hadn't been back in nearly a decade. 7-year-old Mason Bell, the youngest of the bunch, was at the center of it all. His red jacket made him easy to spot as he hurled himself into a towering pile of leaves his uncles had raked together earlier that morning. He shrieked with laughter as he disappeared into the pile, only to emerge again seconds later with leaves in his hair and a triumphant smile on his face. Nearby, his mother, Erin, chatted with her sister over mugs of hot cider, glancing over now and then to check on her son. Every time she looked, there he was laughing, tumbling, crawling through the leaves like they were treasure. Frank Bell, Mason's father, was manning the grill, flipping burgers and telling exaggerated fishing stories to his cousins, his voice rising above the low hum of the gathering. Mason had asked him earlier if the pile was big enough to bury a dinosaur. Frank had promised they'd try to find out after lunch. And then, like a film reel catching on a frame, everything paused. Erin's eyes drifted toward the pile again, expecting that familiar flash of red, that sudden burst of movement. But this time, there was nothing. The pile was still. No giggles, no rustling. Just leaves. Her brow furrowed. She walked closer. "Mason?" she called lightly, expecting a giggle from within. No answer. She bent down, pushing aside leaves with both hands. Nothing. She reached deeper, panic beginning to bloom in her chest. "Mason," she said again, louder now. Frank looked up from the grill. Conversations around the yard quieted. Within moments, the light-hearted afternoon turned frantic. Uncles and aunts sifted through the leaves calling his name. Erin circled the house, her voice sharp and rising. Frank sprinted to the edge of the woods, shouting. The cousins stopped playing. One of the older boys said he saw Mason crawling deeper into the pile just minutes earlier, but no one had seen him come out. The pile was emptied, scattered, nothing, no signs, no tracks, just crushed leaves and the echo of his name in the wind. Mason Bell was gone. By nightfall, floodlights bathed the Bell backyard in harsh white beams, cutting through the dark like interrogations. What had begun as a festive afternoon had twisted into a waking nightmare. Patrol cars lined the street in front of the house, and uniformed officers paced the property, voices clipped and urgent. Police tape crisscrossed the yard, fencing in what hours earlier had been a playground of leaves and laughter. Erin Bell sat on the back steps, a blanket draped around her shoulders, her hands trembling around a paper cup of untouched coffee. Her eyes, wide and red, never left the empty leaf pile or what was left of it. She flinched every time a dog barked or a branch cracked underfoot. Frank stood beside her, arms crossed, jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. He'd given the officers every detail he could remember. What Mason had been wearing, the direction he last saw him facing, the color of his sneakers. Blue, one shoelace always untied. The yard had been cleared of all family members by then except for the Bells. Investigators wanted space, precision. The pile where Mason was last seen had been carefully raked apart by gloved hands and then bagged leaf by leaf, loaded into brown paper sacks marked with evidence tags. Beneath it nothing. No disturbance of soil, no holes, no torn fabric, no sign a child had ever been there. Just grass. Cold and unremarkable. A canine unit arrived just before midnight. The handlers moved efficiently, letting the dogs sniff one of Mason's stuffed animals. The dogs pulled at their leashes, paws dragging in dirt, but then circled back toward the house. They didn't pick up a trail leading away. Not to the woods, not to the road. It was as if the scent stopped dead in the backyard. By morning, news helicopters circled overhead. The local station had picked up the story overnight. Child disappears during family gathering. No signs, no suspects. The footage aired at dawn. Officers combing the backyard in a slow grid pattern, orange-vested volunteers entering the woods, thermal imaging drones mapping the treetops. But there was no Mason. Detective Paul Halter, assigned to lead the case, stood near the grill with a notepad in hand, frowning as he surveyed the yard. "Kids don't just vanish," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Someone always sees something." But no one had. No one heard a scream, saw a struggle, or noticed a shadow. There had been no sound of footsteps leaving through the woods, no tire tracks near the fence. Just Mason's laughter, a rustle in the leaves, and then silence. The first few days passed in a blur of interviews, checklists, and repetition. Detectives set up a temporary command post inside the Bell house, the living room stripped of its warmth and transformed into a hub of grim logistics maps of the neighborhood taped to the walls, timelines scribbled on whiteboards, names written and circled in red. The sound of printers whirring and radios crackling became the new soundtrack of the Bell family home. Every adult who had been at the reunion was questionsome multiple times. The officers were patient at first, understanding the trauma that gripped the family. But with no leads, no ransom note, and no evidence of an outside abduction, the questions took on sharper edges. Who last saw Mason? Who was near him? Who stepped away from the group? The family began to turn inward. Old resentments and private suspicions bubbled up. Frank lashed out at his brother-in-law when he suggested Mason might have wandered off and gotten lost. Aaron broke down crying when asked, for the third time, if there had ever been trouble at home. Everyone looked tired, drawn, their nerves wearing thin with each passing hour of silence. Then there was Liam. At 16, Liam was the oldest of the cousins, tall and lanky with a mop of dark hair that hung over his eyes. He'd been quiet during the reunion, no surprise there, but in the days following Mason's disappearance, his silence thickened into something heavier. When Detective Halter sat him down for questioning, the boy fidgeted constantly. He avoided eye contact, chewed at the sleeve of his hoodie, and answered every question with a muttered, "I don't know," or a shrug. "You said you were near the leaf pile when Mason disappeared," Halter pressed. "What exactly were you doing?" Liam shrugged. "Just hanging out, looking at my phone." "Did you see anyone come near Mason?" Another shrug. "Did you hear anything unusual?" A shake of the head. But something in his body language made the detective pause. Liam's foot tapped rhythmically under the table, and sweat gathered along his hairline despite the cool temperature. When asked to walk through his movements during that afternoon again, Liam's story shifted slightly. First he'd said he was texting, then he said his phone battery was dead. Halter made a note. Later that night, Erin approached Frank quietly in the kitchen. "Something's wrong with Liam," she whispered, eyes puffy. "He won't even look at me. When I asked if he saw anything, he turned pale and said nothing. Just shook his head and walked away." Frank didn't respond at first. He just stared out the window toward the empty backyard, where a single evidence flag still fluttered beside the now flattened leaf pile. "Everyone's breaking," he finally said, "and one of us is hiding something." On the fourth day, just as hope began to fray into desperation, Erin received an email from her cousin Elise, who had driven back home to Seattle the morning after the reunion. Elise had been combing through the dozens of photos she'd taken that afternoon, snapshots of cousins laughing, kids bobbing for apples, Mason mid-leap into the leaf pile, hair flying, arms wide like a bird. The subject line of her email read simply, "Found this. Maybe it helps?" Erin opened the attachment on her laptop at the dining table, while two detectives quietly discussed terrain maps in the next room. The photo loaded slowly, a high-resolution shot captured on Elise's professional camera. It was one of the last images taken before the panic, frozen in golden light and autumn colors. Mason was front and center, caught mid-turn toward the camera, a grin stretching across his face. The leaf pile behind him looked like a crown, leaves mid-air in a spray around him. In the background, the edge of the forest crept up against the lawn, a quiet, familiar wall of trunks and shadows. At first, nothing seemed off, but as Erin leaned closer to the screen, her heart kicked once in her chest. Just past the edge of the cleared grass, in the blur of trees, something didn't belong. She zoomed in. The image grew grainier, but it was still visible, a faint shape among the birch trunks. A vertical smear of black that didn't match any of the surrounding bark. It could have been a shadow. It could have been nothing. But then she saw it, the distinct curve of a shoulder. A head, barely outlined, just enough to suggest someone standing motionless behind the trees, half concealed in the undergrowth. Not walking. Not running. Watching. Erin's blood turned cold. She pulled up another photo, taken seconds before, from a slightly different angle. No figure, just trees. She returned to the one with Mason. The shape was there, still, undeniable. "Detective," she called out, her voice unsteady. "Can you come look at this?" Within minutes, the living room filled with officers, all gathered around the screen. The photo was copied, enhanced, sent to forensic imaging. Measurements were taken, coordinates plotted. They checked every known attendee's clothing from that day. No one had worn anything dark like that. Everyone had been in plaid and denim and autumn layers, no black coat, no figure in the woods. Someone had been there, someone close enough to watch Mason, close enough to wait, and no one had seen a thing. Maple Hollow had always been a quiet town, tucked between long stretches of farmland and state forest, the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, and Sunday potlucks filled the church basement. But when Mason Bell vanished, the silence cracked, and from the fissures came whispers. At first it was concern. Neighbors dropped off meals at the Bell home, offered to join search parties, and left messages of prayer and encouragement on the community bulletin board outside the post office. But as days passed, and no trace of Mason turned up, not a shoe print, not a scream, not a piece of torn fabric, concern soured into something darker. Curiosity, speculation, fear. In line at the diner, people murmured about the old rumors of child trafficking along Highway 23, a corridor between towns that some claimed had long been watched by federal authorities. "It's organized," a woman in line said, low enough to avoid the cook's ear. "You think it doesn't happen in places like this, but that's the mistake. They want quiet towns, less scrutiny." At the gas station, a teenager swore he'd seen coyotes circling the Bell property a week before the reunion. "Big ones," he insisted, eyes wide. "But they weren't acting right. They didn't spook when I honked my horn, just stared. I think maybe something's breeding with them, something wild." His friend nodded solemnly. "There've been those animal attacks up north, near Lake Turney. Remember the hiker they found with his legs chewed up?" The story warped with each retelling. Then came the talk of the woods. The Hollow's eastern border brushed up against nearly 10,000 acres of dense state forest. To kids growing up in town, the woods were a place of campfire stories and dares. Everyone knew the tales of lights in the trees at night, of people hearing drums or whispers after dark. Most dismissed it. But now, they remembered. And they talked. Old Man Duffy, who ran the antique shop on Main, swore up and down that a cult had lived out there in the 1970s, conducting rituals, building underground rooms. "They disappear and resurface every few decades," he claimed. "People don't listen to history. It always comes back." He said it without irony as he rang up a woman buying a pair of porcelain angels. She nodded slowly, not believing, but not entirely dismissing it either. By the end of the week, Mason's name had become almost mythological. The leaf pile, the photo, the figure in the woods, everything lent itself to theories. And as the whispers grew louder, one truth remained. The town that once prided itself on safety was now gripped by the terrifying knowledge that a boy had vanished under their very noses and that someone, or something, had taken him. It was a Tuesday morning when the call came in. Erin was in the kitchen, her hands deep in soapy dishwater, staring absently out the window at the backyard that had become a symbol of loss. Frank was upstairs, sleeping off another sleepless night. The house was still, except for the faint buzz of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of wood settling. The ringtone startled her. She dried her hands quickly and answered. "This is Detective Halter," came the voice, clipped, but with an edge of something else urgency. "Hope? We received a report from authorities in Illinois. A child was found wandering near a rest stop outside of Springfield. No ID, confused, nonverbal. He matches Mason's age and description. We're working with local officers now." For a moment, Erin couldn't breathe. Her knees buckled, and she gripped the counter for support. "Springfield?" she repeated. Are you saying it could be him?" "It's too early to say," Halter replied cautiously. "But we thought you should know. We've requested photographs and are working to confirm fingerprints. They found him less than an hour ago." By the time Frank came downstairs, Erin was already sobbing into her hands. "They think they found him," she said between gasps. "A little boy, in Illinois. It might be Mason." Frank froze mid-step. He sat beside her slowly, like moving too fast would somehow scare the moment away. 10 years, he whispered. 10 years, and he's just there? The next few hours crawled by, every minute dragging behind it a tether of raw nerves and mounting hope. Friends gathered. Erin's sister came over with sandwiches. No one touched. They watched the clock. They paced. They stared at the phone. Then, the second call came. It wasn't him. The boy was younger than Mason. 7, not 17. Brown eyes, not green. No matching birthmark on the collarbone. No reaction to Mason's name. A foster child who'd wandered from a group home traumatized, yes, but not theirs. The silence that followed the call was deeper than the one before it. Erin didn't cry this time. She simply walked upstairs and shut the bedroom door. Frank stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the now cold coffee in his mug. He didn't pour it out. He didn't move. They had been here before, glimpses of hope, mirages that disappeared under scrutiny. But this one had felt different. Closer. Real. And now that it was gone, it left behind a hollowness more unbearable than the waiting. Because it proved the world could still surprise them. Just not in the way they needed. The digging started on a cold morning in early November, 2 weeks after Mason vanished. By then, the leaves had gone damp and brown, sticking to boots and shovels as investigators moved slowly across the backyard, marking the soil with flags and spray paint. The trees stood bare now, skeletal against a gray sky that hadn't cleared in days. Everything felt heavier, like the weather itself had surrendered to the weight of the loss. Detective Halter authorized the excavation after exhausting every other angle. No confirmed sightings, no credible leads. And that photomason mid-laugh, the figure half-shrouded in the trees, still offered more questions than answers, so they went back to the beginning, the place where he was last seen. They started with the leaf pile, or what had once been the leaf pile. It had been flattened, raked, bagged, cataloged. But now the ground beneath it was targeted shovels, slicing through grass and roots, soil collected in tubes for chemical testing. A ground-penetrating radar team scanned for air pockets and disturbances. Nothing showed up. Next, they moved to the far corner of the property, near the tool shed, then to the base of the trees where the figure had been spotted. They dug a trench along the tree line, 3 feet deep, stretching like a scar across the yard. Forensics swept every inch. They found worms, old candy wrappers, a half-buried matchbox car. No bones, no clothes, no Mason. The Bell House, once filled with noise and foot traffic, grew quiet again. The yellow tape came down. The officers left. The flags marking dig sites faded in the weather until they looked like forgotten party decorations. No new updates were shared, Reporters stopped calling. The case turned cold. Erin stopped going into Mason's room. She folded his laundry one final time and closed the door. Frank couldn't sleep upstairs anymore. He took to the living room couch, television flickering through the nights, while he stared at the ceiling. They rarely spoke. When they did, it was in low voices, about mundane things. Grocery lists. Mail. The cracked faucet in the guest bathroom. The space between them expanded in silence. Grief settled into the walls, a presence they no longer acknowledged but always felt. People still asked how they were doing, but the question had changed in tone from hope to pity, from "what do you know" to "how are you holding up?" And neither of them ever had an answer. The call came just after midnight, when the world outside was silent and still. Erin answered on the second ring, her voice hoarse with sleep. On the other end, her cousin Jenna's voice trembled as she spoke the words Erin had expected for years, but still wasn't prepared to hear. "Nana's gone." Agnes Bell family matriarch, iron-willed, sharp-tongued, and the last anchor tying the extended Bell family to its long-standing traditions, had passed in her sleep, 91 years old. Peaceful, alone. The funeral was small and efficient, a closed casket, fall flowers in muted shades. Cousins who hadn't visited in years filed in quietly, exchanged awkward condolences, and disappeared just as quickly. Erin stood beside her father, her eyes dry but heavy, a different kind of mourning pressing down on her. Agnes had raised him in that house, had hosted every reunion there, had kept the family orbiting around her gravity, and now that center was gone. A week after the burial, the Bell house stood empty for the first time in nearly a century. Its windows reflected only sky and wind now, not laughter or music. The estate had to be settled, rooms cleared. Closets emptied. The furniture Agnes refused to part with, her floral couch, the dusty player piano tagged for auction. That's when Roy returned. No one had heard from him in years. He showed up on a Tuesday, unannounced, driving a rusted-out pickup with Oregon plates and a cooler full of beer in the back. Frank was the one who spotted him first, standing on the porch with the same half-smile he wore at 17, only now surrounded by a gray beard and deeper lines around the eyes. "Thought I'd come help," Roy said. "Agnes would haunt me if I didn't." Frank hesitated for a moment too long before opening the door. Erin didn't say much at first, just nodded and offered him coffee that went untouched. Roy had always been the family's drifting constellation, appearing for reunions and birthdays with stories too wild to be real, then vanishing before anyone could question him. He hadn't shown up for Mason's funeral service. But then again, there never had been one. Now he walked the halls slowly, as if reacquainting himself with ghosts. He ran his fingers along picture frames and sighed at the sagging wallpaper. "Place smells the same," he murmured. "Like apples and mothballs." Erin watched him from the kitchen, unsure if she felt resentment or relief. Maybe both. The house needed cleaning, the past needed sorting. And Roy, for all his absence, was still a Bell. Still tied to the yard. Still tied to what had happened. Even if he'd spent the last 10 years pretending it hadn't. The morning after Roy arrived, he took his coffee black and bitter, and stepped barefoot onto the back porch, letting the screen door slap shut behind him. The air was crisp, carrying with it the dampness of early fall and the faint, unmistakable scent of decaying leaves. The yard stretched before him like a forgotten memory, overgrown, uneven, littered with the slow creep of nature reclaiming what had been trimmed and tamed for decades. The grass was long, patchy in places, and goldenrod sprouted where there used to be garden beds. The rusted swing set leaned slightly to one side, vines coiling up its frame like a grip that wouldn't let go. Roy took a slow breath and exhaled through his nose. He hadn't set foot in this backyard in over 10 years. The leaf pile was back. Not the same one, obviously, but in the exact spot, under the oak tree with the split branch that still creaked on windy nights. Nature had a way of repeating itself. Seasons circled back like they had nowhere else to go. The wind blew, the leaves fell, and they gathered, some by wind, some by habit, some by a force harder to name. Roy walked barefoot through the grass, its chill biting at his skin, and stood over the pile. It wasn't raked. It had formed naturally, the wind sweeping leaves into the same hollow depression where Mason had last been seen. The same place that had been dug up, bagged, examined, and then forgotten. The leaves rustled slightly, not from wind, just the faint, shifting kind of sound that made your ears twitch. Roy stared at the pile, a strange stillness washing over him. He wasn't a man given to sentimentality. He'd buried things deeper than grief. But standing there, something pressed in on him. Not guilt exactly, more like gravity. Like this yard had a pull, and he'd been resisting it for too long. He crouched slowly, knees creaking, reached out and ran a hand through the top layer of leaves. They were damp and brittle, sticking to his skin. He lifted a handful and let them fall again. Beneath the surface, he thought he saw something glint, a strip of plastic, a bit of fabric. It was gone before he could find it again. Still, his breath caught. He stood quickly, heart beating a little faster than it should have. Told himself it was nothing, just leaves, just memory. But as he walked back toward the house, he looked over his shoulder once more. The pile hadn't moved. But something deep inside him had. The sun had crested low over the trees when Roy returned to the backyard with a rake in hand, its handle smooth from years of use, its tines rusted but still sharp. He told himself it was for cleanup, that if they were going to sell the house, the yard couldn't look like a haunted forest. But that wasn't the real reason. He hadn't stopped thinking about the leaf pile. Not since the morning before. Not since that glint. He started at the edges of the yard, dragging the rake through brittle debris, letting the scrape and shuffle of leaves fill the silence. The rhythm was almost meditative: pull, gather, lift, dump. Each movement slow, deliberate. He worked his way across the grass until he reached it. The pile. It had grown since yesterday. Wind, maybe, or the tree just shedding what little it had left. Roy stood over it for a long time before raising the rake and dragging it through. The resistance came on the second pass. A sudden jerk against the handle, like the rake had snagged something stubborn, not a root, not a stone, something that gave slightly, but not enough. Roy paused, frowned, and set the rake aside. He dropped to one knee and began to dig with his hands, brushing away damp leaves until his fingers struck a slick, crinkled surface. Plastic. His breath hitched. He pulled at it gently. The edges of the material came loose from the soil, coated in mud and crushed oak leaves. It was thick and cloudy, industrial, like the kind used for tarps or bags. He kept pulling until the object came free. Inside the folds of plastic was a small, muddied sneaker. Blue canvas, frayed laces, the fabric worn thin at the heel. Roy didn't need to check the size tag or find its twin. He knew that shoe. They all did. It was Mason's. He sat back slowly, the breath leaving his lungs like a deflating tire. The sneaker lay in his lap, resting in the plastic like something embalmed. The memories rushed in all at once: Mason on the porch steps, bouncing one foot in the air while Aaron knelt to double knot his shoes. The way the laces never stayed tied. The way that one shoe had a smudge of orange paint from a school art project. Roy didn't realize he was shaking until the rake tipped over behind him. He looked toward the house. For a moment he didn't move. Couldn't. Then, with the shoe cradled in his arms like a fragile relic, he stood. The leaves behind him stirred in the wind as he stepped off the grass and toward the truth no one had ever found. Until now. By evening, the sirens returned, not loud and urgent like before, but low and steady, a grim procession rather than a chase. The blue and red lights flashed across the faded siding of the bell house as officers strung fresh yellow tape across the fence. It had been nearly 10 years since police last stood on this lawn with purpose. This time, they brought shovels and silence. Roy sat on the porch steps, hands smeared with soil, the shoe wrapped in a clean kitchen towel on the bench beside him. He hadn't said much after calling Aaron. Just gave her the same words he'd given the dispatcher. "I found something. It's Mason's." Aaron had arrived before the cruisers, breathless and pale, eyes locked on the towel as if it were radioactive. She hadn't touched it. She couldn't. Frank showed up soon after, hair uncombed, shirt buttoned wrong, as if he'd dressed in the dark. They didn't speak to each other. Just stood on opposite sides of the yard, watching strangers enter the space they once called home. Detective Halter, older, now, hair thinning, his gait slower, stepped from his unmarked vehicle with a look that flickered between vindication and dread. He greeted the team quietly, issued orders, and approached Roy without ceremony. "You're sure it's his?" Roy nodded. "I remember the paint mark. Orange. From a pumpkin he brought home from school." Forensics confirmed it within hours. Traces of Mason's DNA remained beneath the insole, preserved by time and the plastic. The shoe had been buried carefully, deliberately, just deep enough to be hidden, but close enough to the surface that time might eventually uncover it. And it had. By nightfall, the backyard had transformed again. Floodlights returned, cameras mounted on tripods, grids mapped out in orange string. Only this time, there was no assumption. They weren't searching for a runaway story, they were hunting a grave. The digging started at dawn. Unlike the first time, this wasn't about speed, it was about precision. Soil was removed inch by inch, sifted through gloved fingers. Roy watched from the porch, arms folded tightly, a cigarette burning low between two fingers he never noticed shaking. Mid-morning, the lead technician called out softly, just a word, not a shout. A hollow beneath the surface. The officers closed in. Shovels stopped. Brushes came out. What they unearthed was a depression in the ground, the remnants of a disturbed patch of earth that hadn't fully settled back. A shallow grave. No bones, not yet, but remnant cloth fibers, the faint imprint of something once weighted down. A child's shape, a secret buried too close to the surface to stay hidden forever. And the case, long left to dust and silence, breathed again. They uncovered the items with the reverence of archaeologists brushing dust from sacred relics. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as gloved hands parted the damp soil to reveal what had been resting beneath it for nearly a decade. The shallow grave gave up its contents one by one, not a body, not the skeletal remains they'd feared, but objects. Pieces of a life paused mid-sentence. The first thing they found was the hat. Mason's blue knit beanie, the one with the little red patch sewn onto the side by Aaron after he tore it climbing a fence. It was stained now, the color faded, but the patch was unmistakable. Aaron saw it from across the yard and nearly collapsed. Then came the backpack. Small, child-sized, gray with lime green straps, still zipped. When they opened it, the air filled with the faint, musty scent of paper that had been sealed away too long. Inside were colored pencils, a broken eraser, and a folder containing 2 crumpled sheets of notebook paper. Drawings. Mason's hand was instantly recognizable: thick lines, uneven coloring, the joyful mess of a child who drew more for feeling than form. One showed a stick figure boy with wild hair standing beside a tall oak tree. The other was more troubling, the same boy standing next to a shadowy figure without a face. The figure had long arms. One hand reached out and touched the boy's shoulder. Detective Halter studied the second drawing with a furrowed brow, saying nothing, but his grip on the page tightened slightly. There was Moria granola bar still in its wrapper, expired by years but untouched, a note card with Mason's name written in block letters. And at the bottom of the grave, tucked beneath a piece of cloth that had once been a towel, was a photograph. A family picture. The Bells on the back porch, smiling Frank, Aaron, and Mason between them, arms outstretched, like airplane wings. Aaron took one look and had to turn away. The question spread like wildfire among the investigators. Why were these things buried here? Preserved, intact, chosen. It didn't feel like a careless discard. It felt intentional, like a message or a shrine. Some thought it was a child's way of hiding treasure. Others weren't so sure, because there were no remains. And too much care had been taken. Someone had wanted these things hidden, but not forgotten, not destroyed. Someone had placed them here with purpose. And now the question that haunted everyone wasn't just, where is Mason? But who put these here and why? They found the diary tucked between the pages of a warped sketchbook inside the backpack, sealed in a zippered pouch, along with a few broken crayons and a folded-up paper airplane. The cover was soft, dark green, the kind sold in multi-packs at the grocery store, cheap cardboard and wide-ruled pages inside. Mason's name was scrawled across the front, in uneven black marker. Mason B. in letters that leaned uphill. Erin recognized it instantly. She remembered buying the notebook with him one rainy Saturday afternoon, after he'd announced at the breakfast table that he wanted to write about stuff like grown-ups do. She hadn't thought he'd kept it. Now it was in Detective Halter's hands. They flipped through it slowly, carefully. The first entries were innocent, simple. Exactly what you'd expect from a 7-year-old learning how to turn thoughts into sentences. Today I saw a squirrel, and it looked like it was smiling at me. My mom made spaghetti, but the noodles were sticky. Dad let me use the hose and I got his shoes wet. He said, "Mason," like he was mad, but then he laughed. Each entry was dated, though not all of them were in order. The handwriting was erratic, full of misspellings, but unmistakably Mason's. Joyful, honest. He wrote about leaf piles and cartoons, about wanting a dog, and how he thought broccoli should be illegal. Normal things, safe things. But about halfway through, something shifted. The handwriting became more rigid, the spacing unnatural. The words changeless, like a child speaking and more like someone dictating. There was no warning, no obvious break, just a line. I must be very quiet now, I must not cry. Crying is for little boys. Another entry. Today I learned a lot. I am not supposed to miss Mom or Dad. They are not real anymore. I am being watched from the trees, and I am safe here. I have a new name. Erin stared at the page, numb. The final entry was the most disturbing. If I do good, I will get to go outside. I think I was bad before, but now I am learning how to be good. He says I am almost ready. I say yes so I can see the sun again. I say yes so he stops being mad. Halter turned the book closed with a slow hand. No one spoke for a long moment. This was Mason's diary, Mason's handwriting. But these last pages didn't sound like a boy. They sounded like someone trying to become one. Or worse, someone else trying to speak through him. Detective Halter had been staring at the diary for most of the morning when something clicked, not a memory exactly, but a gap, a space where something had always felt off. The cousin, Liam. 16 at the time of Mason's disappearance. Quiet, detached, evasive in every interview, and then gone. He had moved away shortly after the investigation went cold, sent to live with his mother's sister in upstate New York. Everyone said it was for a change of scenery, something to help him heal. No one questioned it. Not then. Not when grief had dulled everyone's judgment and the town was desperate to feel normal again. But now, sitting at his desk beneath a wall of photos and evidence bags, Halter pulled the original interview transcripts. Liam had said almost nothing, couldn't recall details. Couldn't remember where he'd been standing when Mason vanished, couldn't explain why he hadn't joined the search. His responses were robotic, as if he'd memorized the idea of innocence, but hadn't quite learned how to perform it. So, Halter made the call. It took 3 hours, 2 subpoenas, and a court order to access the records. Liam's medical history had been sealed, flagged as sensitive psychological trauma following a family loss, the paperwork said. But under the legal layers and institutional red tape, something waited. Liam had been admitted to Fairmont Psychiatric Clinic in March 2014, 5 months after Mason disappeared. He had stayed for nearly a year. The intake report detailed erratic behavior, night terrors, mute spells that lasted days. He'd been found sleepwalking multiple times, once in the snow without shoes. And then, more troubling, the drawings. Halter stared at the scanned copies the hospital had included. The figures were crude, childlike, but disturbing faceless people with long arms, trees with eyes. A small boy always placed at the center, usually inside a box or a hole, sometimes with hands reaching down toward him. Written beside one drawing in shaky block letters, He is still in the dirt, but the dirt keeps breathing. Liam had never mentioned Mason's name in therapy, not once. And yet every page reeked of memory, of something seen, something carried. When Halter asked Erin if the family knew about the hospitalization, her face went white. "No," she whispered. "They said he was doing better, that he was just struggling with school. No one ever told us this." Liam had left behind no forwarding address, no phone number, just silence. And now that silence felt like it had teeth. It was just after dusk when the call came into the station. The receptionist transferred it to Halter's desk with a note clipped to the receiver. Says, "She used to work with Mason Bell, therapist." Sounds rattled. Halter picked up, expecting the usual another psychic tip, another long shot. But the voice that greeted him was steady, measured, a woman in her late 50s, calm but shaken at the edges. "My name is Dr. Laura Mendel," she began. "I was Mason Bell's child psychologist. I worked with him for about 8 months before he disappeared." Halter's pen stopped mid-note. "I'm sorry I didn't come forward earlier," she said quickly. "But I wasn't sure what I had was relevant, and by the time I did, everything had moved on. I convinced myself it wasn't important." "What do you remember?" Halter asked. A long pause, a breath. "He was imaginative," she said finally. "Creative. Not in the wild, chaotic. Way more like he saw things in ways other children didn't. His drawings were vivid, full of stories. But about a month before he disappeared, something shifted." "Shifted how?" "He began to fixate on something he called the dark door," she said. "At first I thought it was metaphor. He said there was a door in the ground, under the leaves. Not a trap door, not a cellar, just a door. That when it opened, the world got quiet. That someone waited underneath it." Halter was silent. "He said it had no knob, that only some people could open it, and that sometimes he dreamed it opened on its own." "Did he say where it was?" Halter asked. "In his backyard," she replied, her voice dropping. "Always the backyard. He said it whispered when no one was watching." Halter felt the chill run up his spine. "Did he mention anyone else being there? Another person?" he pressed. "Yes," Dr. Mendel said. "He called him the Watcher, said he wore skin-like clothes. I assumed it was some sort of nightmare, trauma response. But now—" She didn't finish the sentence. Halter sat back in his chair, the phone pressed to his ear, staring through the blinds at the darkened street beyond the station. He didn't believe in monsters, not the kind hiding under beds. But children saw things adults had long forgotten how to notice, and maybe Mason had been trying to name something real the only way he knew how. A door in the ground. And someone waiting behind it. The blueprint was old, brittle in places, the corners yellowed like parchment left too long in the sun. It had been filed away in the county records office under a different surname. L. Bell was a married name. The house had belonged to Agnes's side of the family long before it became the backdrop of tragedy. No one had thought to look before. Why would they? The house had been combed, the yard dug, the ground turned over like a grave. But the plans told a different story. There, beneath a penciled sketch of the house, under the back portion of the yard, was a square room marked root cellar sealed 1978. Halter stared at it for a long time. That far corner of the property had always been slightly raised, a mound no one questioned. Over the years, trees had taken root around it, their growth swallowing any evidence that something man-made lay beneath. But it had been there the whole time. A decision was made quickly. By noon, the excavation crew arrived with ground-penetrating radar and structural engineers. They cleared away brush, tree roots, and decades of layered earth, until the outline began to emerge, a series of stone slabs set into the ground like a forgotten vault, cemented shut, covered with a thick layer of soil and time. When the first slab was lifted, the smell hit them, not death, but something else. Rot, damp, the scent of a space that had been closed off from air and light for too long. Flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing stone walls and a rusted metal staircase descending into the earth. A root cellar, just like the plans said. Except this one was different. It had been altered. The walls bore scratch marks, faint but deliberate. Not animal, not erosion. On one wall, someone had etched a drawing crude, childlike, a stick figure under a tree, another standing at a door. In the corner of the room, they found remnants of fabric, a threadbare blanket, a milk crate stacked with snack wrappers and old comic books. There was no furniture, no working light, just space. Silence. A place where someone could stay hidden. A place where someone could be kept. Erin stood at the edge of the cellar, arms wrapped around herself, eyes wide and wet. She didn't ask if Mason had been there. She knew. And now, finally, so did the rest of the world. The air inside the root cellar was heavy and still, like it hadn't been breathed in years. Every footstep echoed too loudly, bounced off the stone and stuck to the skin. Flashlights darted across the walls, casting long shadows that made the cramped space feel deeper, darker. What they found inside was not a relic of some bygone era used for potatoes and preserves. It was something else entirely. It was a room. Lived in, used. Against the far wall, under a narrow arch of exposed brick, lay a stained, flattened mattress child-sized. No sheets, no frame. Just foam, torn at the corners, with a threadbare cartoon pillow pressed into the wall like someone had tried to disappear into it. The floor around it was scattered with bits of debris, candy wrappers, plastic forks, an empty juice box so faded it looked like it had been bleached by darkness rather than sun. And the drawings. They were everywhere. Done in crayon, pencil, even smudged charcoal, dozens of them covered the stone walls like a silent confession. One showed a boy standing alone beneath a stick tree, his arms straight down, his face a blank oval. Another was a series of jagged lines and circles over and over, looping into itself like a maze with no exit. Then there were the hands. Hands reaching down from the ceiling, hands stretching out of the ground. Always too long, too thin. Near the back wall, Halter crouched beside a tin lunchbox half buried under dust. He opened it carefully, revealing dried apple slices sealed in plastic, a spoon wrapped in a paper napkin, and a small matchbox car with chipped blue paint. He closed it again, slowly. Nothing inside screamed criminal, and yet everything about it whispered fear. Someone had stayed here. That much was undeniable. Not for an hour, not for a night, for days, weeks, maybe longer. There was a bucket in the corner, half covered with a cracked lid. They didn't open it. They didn't need to. Erin refused to go down at first, but when she did, it was like something in her stopped resisting. She touched the wall beside the mattress, her hand brushing a faded drawing of a sun with a face lopsided, smiling, surrounded by crooked rays. He was here, she said, her voice so soft it barely reached the others. This was his world. And for the first time, the space they'd all dismissed as a forgotten cellar became something far worse. A cage someone had built beneath their feet. And no one had heard a thing. It was Halter who found the camera, tucked behind a loose brick on the far wall, wrapped in a tattered flannel shirt like someone had meant to hide it, not discard it, but keep it safe. The camcorder was old, early 2000s style, boxy and gray, the kind sold in electronics aisles next to discount DVDs. Dust coated the lens, and the battery was long dead, but inside the compartment a tape was still loaded. Another two lay beside it, bundled in rubber bands, each labeled in shaky, blocky handwriting. MB1, MB2, MB3. Forensics cataloged them carefully, slipping the tapes into evidence bags as if they might burn on contact. No one said it aloud, but the air shifted the moment the tapes were discovered. Something sacred had been pierced, something personal. The first tape was played in the police tech lab, under fluorescent lights, and a hush that fell the moment the footage began. The screen flickered, static. Then, color. A shaky shot of the root cellar. Not as it was now, but lived in. The mattress intact. Drawings freshly taped to the walls. And in the center of the frame, Mason. He couldn't have been more than 7, exactly as he was the day he vanished. Thin. Pale. wearing the same hoodie he had on in the last family photos. He sat cross-legged, eating dry cereal from a bag, his eyes darting toward the camera every few seconds. Not scared exactly, just aware, too aware for a child that age. There was no sound, just the soft hum of the tape. The video cut. Came back. Mason again, this time lying on the mattress, holding a flashlight up to the ceiling, drawing on the stone with it like a wand. Another cut. And then, the figure. It appeared from the corner of the screen, slow-moving, hunched, wearing a mask fabric, white, with 2 dark eye holes and a stitched mouth, the kind a child might make from a pillowcase. It stepped into frame and stood beside Mason, who didn't react, didn't look up. He just kept tracing invisible lines with his flashlight. The masked figure raised a hand and gently placed it on Mason's head. Not striking, not restraining, just resting, like a benediction. The room went still. In the lab, someone muttered a curse under their breath. Another officer turned away from the screen. The tape continued. Uneventful minutes of silence, of stillness, of watching. That was the worst part. The watching. Because whoever had filmed it hadn't just recorded a child in captivity. They had cared for him. Prepared for this. Like they were making memories no one else was ever meant to see. The footage was handed over to the forensic lab that same evening, sealed in evidence sleeves and delivered with a quiet urgency that suggested they all knew what might be coming. No one said the name, yet not out loud, but it hung between every breath in the station like a held note. Halter didn't sleep. He watched the tapes again, frame by frame, in a small, windowless room, the screen throwing flickering light against his face like a lantern in a crypt. By morning, the enhancements came back. The figure in the mask was taller than Mason by at least 2 feet. The footage was low resolution, but new software clarified the gait, slowed the steps. The movement was unmistakable, a limp. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, but subtle. The kind you'd miss in a crowd. A favoring of the left leg. A slight hitch in the stride. Halter closed his eyes. He remembered Liam in the backyard that day 16, withdrawn and always just slightly behind the others. Said he twisted his knee at football practice. Wore a brace for a few months. No one had paid it any mind. Until now. They pulled up his records again. Liam Bell. Transferred schools 6 months after Mason vanished. Hospitalized the next spring. Diagnosed with dissociation, night terrors, aggressive outbursts. His mother, Agnes's niece, had kept most of it quiet, said he just needed a fresh start, a quieter environment. But he wasn't living with her anymore. He was at Glenvale Psychiatric, voluntary commitment, high security, still there. Halter called ahead, asked to speak with the head of the facility. He didn't say why, not yet. The question he couldn't stop circling. Had Liam kept Mason in that cellar? It didn't feel possible, it didn't feel real, but neither did a child vanishing into a leaf pile without a trace, neither did a camcorder showing years-old truths buried in earth. And now, with every step the masked figure took on that screen, Halter felt the ground shift. Because it wasn't just the limp. It was the body language. The way the figure moved around Mason, not like a stranger holding him captive, but like someone trying to comfort him, awkwardly, cautiously, like guilt made flesh. They would bring in Liam. They would ask the questions that should have been asked a decade ago. And if he was the one behind the mask, then Mason hadn't just been stolen. He had been hidden by blood, by family. And somehow, none of them had seen it. They found the map inside the sketchbook, tucked between 2 crumpled pages of unfinished drawings, one of a bird with mismatched wings, the other a jagged shape that looked like a mountain or maybe a scream. The map was done in pencil on lined paper, the kind pulled from a school notebook. It was uneven, the lines faint, parts erased, and redrawn until the whole thing looked like a thought struggling to stay alive. But it was a map. At the center was a rough square labeled, "My Room," and beneath it, in smaller letters, "The Quiet House." Arrows extended out in crooked directions, one toward stairs, another toward Where the wind goes. One led directly to the edge of the page, toward something scrawled in bolder strokes, the barn. Halter leaned over the table, studying it in silence. The others watched too, not sure whether to speak or hold their breath. "Could just be a game," someone said finally. "Kids draw stuff like this all the time." But Erin shook her head from her place by the door. She hadn't said much since the camcorder footage, since the voice of her missing child had filled the speakers. Now, she stepped closer, fingers trembling as she reached for the paper. "No," she said. "He used to draw treasure maps. He'd label everything. His closet, the doghouse, even the broken fence. This," she tapped the crude square. "This looks like him trying to tell us something real." The barn hadn't been used in years. It sat at the far end of the property, sagging under the weight of time, its doors warped and nailed shut after a storm knocked part of the roof loose. For years, it had been dismissed just another old structure on family land. But the map pointed there. More importantly, the map showed paths, lines that twisted like veins under the yard. Some stopped abruptly, others looped back. One traced a careful curve that passed beneath the oak tree where Mason had last been seen. And all of it started from my room, the cellar. A team was dispatched immediately. Ground radar confirmed disturbances beneath the yard-narrow tunnels, branching like roots from the cellar outward. One led directly to the barn. As the officers moved across the property, cutting through overgrowth and prying open the warped doors, Erin stayed behind. She watched from the kitchen window, the map still in her hands. Mason hadn't just survived. He'd mapped his world. And now, finally, they were following his way out. The machinery groaned as it dug into the frozen ground, shovels and excavators chipping away at earth that hadn't been disturbed in decades. A pale morning sun hovered over the trees, casting long shadows across the Bell property while detectives, forensic techs, and local deputies gathered around the barn, now unsealed and flanked by yellow tape. What had once been a forgotten outbuilding now loomed like a sentinel, standing watch over the truth buried below. The ground-penetrating radar had lit up the screens like a heartbeat, pulsing with faint signals that told them what they needed to know, voids beneath the surface. Not natural pockets, not erosion. Something carved by hand, a path. The dig team started at the cellar entrance, following the trajectory Mason had drawn on the Mathis' careful pencil lines, now dictating the movements of grown men in gloves and tactical boots. Every foot of progress was slow, deliberate. The soil grew more compact, the deeper they went. But then, suddenly, it gave way. A hollow. They stopped digging and cleared the rest with hand tools and brushes. What they uncovered was a collapsed chamberet's roof caved in, beams splintered, and buried in a layer of mud and silt. The air was thick and sour, rising in damp waves from the opening, as if the earth itself had been holding its breath. Inside, partially encased in dirt and debris, were bones. A full skeleton, curled slightly, knees drawn toward the chest, as if the person had died, trying to stay warm or small or hidden. The clothing had long since decayed, but metal grommets and buttons remained, tarnished and fragile. A wristwatch was found near the right hand, stopped at 4:12. No one said whether it was morning or night. A hush fell over the team as the forensic unit moved in. No one needed to be told what they had found. The size of the remains, the depth of the chamberette all pointed to something that had nothing to do with Mason Bell. But someone had been here. Another child. Later, dental records would confirm what the detectives feared. The remains matched a boy reported missing 15 years earlier in a neighboring county. A case that had gone cold, forgotten, until now. Erin, standing at the edge of the barn, clutched Mason's map to her chest. Whatever Mason had survived, he hadn't been the first. And someone had buried the others where no one thought to look. Until he showed them. It took 3 days to get confirmation. Halter paced the hallway outside the forensics lab like a man waiting for a verdict, each footstep dull against the scuffed linoleum. He'd stopped pretending to check his watch hours ago. Aaron and Frank were at home here, what used to be home, clinging to a silence that had settled over them like fog, the kind that didn't lift, just thickened with time. When the tech finally emerged, she was holding a sealed envelope with blue latex gloves still on her hands. Her face gave nothing away, not relief, not grief, just the neutrality of science doing its work. "The bones aren't Mason's," she said. The words landed like a stone in the stomach. Halter exhaled once, long and low, his shoulders briefly sagging. Not him. Still no Mason. But then she said something else. "They're from a male adolescent, likely between 13 and 15. The DNA is a match for a missing persons case. Travis Gentry disappeared in 2008 from Riverview County." Halter blinked. He remembered the name, the face. A faded poster that had hung on the break room bulletin board for months after the boy vanished. Travis Gentry, 14 years old, last seen riding his bike near a wooded trail just 2 towns over. No sign of struggle, no bike, no clues. Until now. He took the report from her hands and stared at the test results. The data reduced to rows of sequences and identifiers, all leading to one chilling conclusion. The tunnel didn't just connect to Mason. It connected to a pattern, to a timeline no one had ever seen, or maybe no one had ever wanted to. Aaron sat at the kitchen table when Halter told her, fingers wrapped tightly around a lukewarm cup of tea. She didn't speak, just nodded once and looked past him, out the window toward the barn. "So it was used before," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Before Mason?" "Yes," Halter replied. "And probably not just once." Frank stood behind her, his jaw tight, his arms crossed like he was holding himself in. He didn't ask questions. Maybe he didn't want the answers. The discovery changed everything. What had once been an isolated disappearance was now part of something larger, something older. The tunnel had been used. The chamber had held another child. And someone had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden until it collapsed under the weight of time and truth. Mason's story wasn't the first chapter. And if they didn't find him soon, it might not be the last. It was Roy who found it, 2 days after the DNA results came in. The house had been quieter than usual, cloaked in the kind of tension that follows a revelation too large to fully process. The barn, the tunnel, the bones, they had all cracked open, something that couldn't be closed again. Still, Roy kept cleaning. It gave him something to do, something to hold on to. He was clearing out the upstairs hallway closet when he noticed the panelone of those narrow wood slats that didn't quite sit flush with the others. He tapped it lightly, hollow. A little pressure from a screwdriver popped the panel loose, revealing a shallow cavity behind it. Dust billowed out in a thick breath, and inside was a shoebox, yellowed with age, its edges warped. No lock, no label. Inside, resting atop a bundle of photographs, was a letter. The envelope was brittle and unsealed, addressed in familiar cursive, to be read if it ever comes back. Roy stared at it, heart crawling slowly into his throat. He opened it with careful fingers and read in silence. Then he carried it downstairs to Halter, who was seated at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a map of the tunnel system. "This was in the wall," Roy said simply, and handed him the letter. The pages trembled slightly in Halter's grip as he unfolded them. The handwriting was unmistakable. Agnes Bell. "I was a girl when I first saw the tunnel. My father told me it was a root cellar, but I knew even then it was more. There were passages, old and narrow, built before the house. He said they were part of the original homestead shelters from storms. But I saw other things down there. Scratches, blankets, things that didn't belong in a cellar." She went on to describe hearing noises at night. Whispers through floorboards. Once, a voice. Then, silence. Her father sealed the entrance in 1978, claimed it had collapsed. She never believed him. "When Mason disappeared, I thought of the tunnel, but I told myself it was just coincidence. I couldn't bear to dig that part of the past back up. I told the police everything except that. I told my own children everything except that." At the bottom of the letter, the ink had smudged with what might have been water or tears. If someone finds this, it means I failed, and I am sorry." Halter folded the letter slowly, his jaw clenched. Erin sat in the doorway, silent, her eyes on the floor. The truth had always been there, buried in the walls. They just never thought to look. They saved the final tape for last. It had no label, just a faded black casing and a brittle strip of masking tape across the spine, smeared with what looked like fingerprints, long dried. It was found buried beneath the mattress in the root cellar, wrapped in a plastic sandwich bag, sealed with tape. Whoever had hidden it hadn't wanted it watched. Or maybe they wanted it found, just not too soon. In the station's evidence room, under the soft hum of a dusty ceiling light, Halter loaded the tape into the aging camcorder and pressed play. The screen blinked twice, then lit with the familiar grain of analog footage. The tunnel. It came into focus slowly, a camera left on, possibly forgotten or placed deliberately to catch something. The angle was low, tilted upward from the ground. A flicker of movement. Then Mason appeared. He was thinner now, older by months or weeks. The same hoodie, though it hung looser on him, sleeves too long. He crept into frame from the far end of the room, flashlight clenched in one hand. His movements were slow, deliberate, not like someone exploring but someone escaping. He paused near the edge of the frame, crouched by the wall, and began prying at a loose board. The tunnel. It had always been there, just hidden behind the wall like a scar beneath clothing. Mason wriggled through the opening and vanished into the darkness. The camera kept rolling. For a long time, there was nothing. Then blurry movement. A shaky camera, as if someone picked it up and followed. The tunnel walls flashed by in disjointed blinks, the light bobbing. There was no sound except the whir of the tape and the soft scuff of footsteps. Eventually, the lens caught him again. Mason, crawling on hands and knees through the narrow dirt passage, light ahead of him, now sunlight, faint and golden, filtering through slats of wood. The barn. But just before he reached it, just before he could push through the floorboards, the camera jerked away, turned back down the tunnel. A second figure. Blurry, unclear, not masked, just shadowed, adult-sized. They stepped into the frame, not running, not chasing, reaching. They knelt beside Mason and whispered something, their hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Then the screen went black. The tape ended. There was no date, no follow-up. Just the moment, Mason almost free, almost gone, and someone helping him the rest of the way. But who? And why had he never come back? It was a still frame pulled from the final seconds of the tap, grainy, distorted, the color bleeding out in places like an old photograph left in the sun. For hours, Halter and the forensic team pored over it, enhancing every angle, slowing the flicker until the figure at the end of the tunnel came into partial view. No mask, no disguise. Just an older man, hair thin and silver, bent slightly at the spine. The light had caught his face just long enough to reveal the line of his jaw, the curve of his brow. It wasn't Liam. It wasn't anyone in the family. Facial recognition ran for hours before the hit came back. Walter Crane, former neighbor, lived 2 doors down from the Bells at the time of Mason's disappearance. Retired mechanic, widowed, known for feeding strays and keeping to himself. He'd moved away 6 years ago, to a veterans care facility outside of town. No record, no history of violence, no reason to suspect him. Until now. Halter made the visit himself, taking the still frame, the tape, and a folder filled with 10 years of unanswered questions. Walter was in the facility's sunroom when they arrived, wrapped in a thick cardigan, staring through the glass at a garden just beginning to frost over. He didn't ask why they'd come. He just nodded toward the chair across from him. "I thought this day might come," he said. The story unfolded slowly, like a wound reopening. He'd seen Mason years ago, that day. Said he had spotted the boy crawling from beneath the barn floor while taking his dog for a walk. The child was thin, filthy, terrified. Said nothing, just shook. Walter hadn't known what to do. But then he'd heard footsteps behind them, someone else coming. And Mason had clung to his leg like a lifeline. He took him, hit him. Whoever had him, they weren't done, Walter said. I saw it in his eyes. The boy needed more than police, he needed time. He wouldn't say where Mason had gone, said he'd made a promise. But he said something else, too. He didn't die. I made sure of that. He's out there, grew up, maybe different, but alive. Halter didn't speak for a long time. When he returned to the Bells' home, he told them everything Walter had said. Frank sat down hard in a kitchen chair. Erin pressed her hands to her mouth. It wasn't certainty, but it was something else. Hope.